Okay, this is it. This is the last lecture. Chapter 14 is the last chapter in the book. It's all about mental health and cultural structures that change the way we see things. Whoops, I skipped one. There we go. Cultural psychology, last chapter. This is the third edition. I think you guys may have the fourth edition. I have a copy of it at my office, but not here. What counts as a disorder? Psychological disorders are defined as rare behaviors that somehow impair the individual. The problem, what type of impairment is problematic, and what if a behavior that is rare in one context is not rare in another? Indeed, some psychopathologies are more prevalent or manifest in highly different forms across cultures, and we're going to look at some of these. Experiencing a culture-bound syndrome generally requires one to have cultural beliefs associated with the syndrome. And of course, we can look at the concept of skinwalkers. Skinwalkers don't exist in anybody else's culture except for the Dene people. It's not found among the Northern Plains Indians. It's not found in the woodlands Indians from the farther east of here. It is a concept, a taboo, an idea that only exists in the Dene culture. Dhat is a morbid anxiety seen most frequently among South Asian males, that they are losing or leaking semen, and it is believed that loss of sperm results in the person getting seriously ill. This often results from anxieties about disapproved sexual acts such as masturbation, where they are losing semen willingly or voluntarily. So this is seen as an anxiety that is created from that problem. This dot would be a meaningless label in the United States, however, where there are no cultural beliefs about the vitality that sperm endows, and no cultural beliefs about the consequences of loss of sperm. Is it possible that other cultures suffer from some psychological disorders as the West, but don't have the same cultural beliefs associated with Western diagnoses, making them meaningless in other cultural contexts? And the answer is, oh yeah. Hikikomori is a condition in Japan characterized by living in an asocial state with no intimate relationships with anyone outside of the immediate family. It first appears in junior high, and they end up reading books, watching TV, or playing games in their rooms. Indications are that the cause may be failure to succeed in a social world that has few options for those who don't fit in. This does not conform to criteria for any of the DSM-5 diagnoses. It has only recently become a cultural phenomenon and is now seen, although rarely, in other East Asian countries besides Japan. Of course, Hikikomori is a name given to it in Japan. Approximately one child per classroom in junior high and high school is afflicted with Hikikomori, largely not existent in pre-war Japan and uncommon in other cultures. And as you can see, she looks like something of a hoarder, and she's got all those plush dolls on her bed in the background. Hikikomori. Bulimia nervosa is uncontrollable binge eating. Individual then takes inappropriate measures to prevent weight gain. It's absent in most cultures of the world, making it a culture-bound syndrome, especially in cultures where food is not abundant. Eating disorders affect many people in the West, but there are some nuances when it comes to determining universality of these conditions. Bulimia appears to be a culture-bound syndrome because rates have increased over time, and the age of people being diagnosed with bulimia has gotten lower over the years. It is also more prevalent in some societies, particularly those with Western influences, than others. In particular, it is absent in most cultures of the world, especially in cultures where food is not abundant. There is a good evidence that bulimia is a culture-bound syndrome. Anorexia nervosa is an individual's refusal to maintain normal body weight due to preoccupation with their body. Evidence of culture-bound status, huge increase in rates of anorexia this century, primarily found in only some cultures. Evidences of universality, there are reports of self-starvation in numerous cultural contexts, but not due to body image. It's only in the West that body image has become the criteria for anorexia nervosa. As with bulimia, rates of anorexia have significantly increased over time, and it is absent in many cultures. However, it has been found in cultures that have very little Western influence, and it also manifests differently in some other contexts as well. Symptoms resembling anorexia have also been noted among ascetics who refuse food for religious reasons, and in the 17th and 18th century among teenage girls who starved themselves to model themselves after ascetics. Ascetics are people that believe so strongly in a philosophy or a religion that they refuse to eat. These people are found, there are ascetics that are found in India. These individuals beg for their food, and at select times they will fast for an extended period of time, only drinking water. Well, in the 16th and 17th and 18th centuries in Europe, there were some teenage girls who also starved themselves because they wanted to be as pure as they possibly could be so that they could go to heaven. There was a great fear in the 17th and 18th century that somebody wouldn't be able to go to heaven. So you did whatever you needed to do in order to make sure that you were heaven bound. This historical record of anorexia, as well as evidence of anorexia in many non-Western contexts, have led some to argue that it is a universal disorder, although it may serve different functions in different places. For example, religious reasons versus weight loss reasons. And this is a picture of Mahatma Gandhi, of course, who starved himself in order to get the British to do what he wanted them to do. Koro is a morbid anxiety about one's penis shrinking into one's body, primarily found in South and East Asia. It is unclear what aspects of culture have led to the emergence of Koro. Koro-like symptoms have been found in some individuals in West African cultures, as well as in individuals in American culture who have had negative marijuana-induced experiences. It's a fear that your penis is shrinking inside your body. Amok is an acute outburst of unrestrained violent and homicidal attacks preceded by brooding, followed by exhaustion and amnesia. Most common in Southeast Asia, it may result from having no acceptable means to express your frustration. And of course, these boys in England are going amok. Hysteria is a commonly diagnosed condition in the 19th century Europe among women. Symptoms include temporary blindness, insomnia, fainting, and loss of appetite for food and sex. Rates of hysteria diagnosis dropped dramatically in the early 20th century. Some think this is due to its being replaced by other diagnostic categories, while others think that it was associated with repressive Victorian cultural norms. And of course, this is primarily what Freud was talking about. He talked about hysteria all the time. Women having hysterical blindness or hysterical paralysis or whatever. And a lot of it had to do with sexual repression. There was a lot of sexual repression during the Victorian era. You weren't supposed to think about sex. You weren't supposed to talk about sex. They changed the names of table legs from legs to limbs. They referred to them as limbs. And the reason they did that is because they didn't want men to get sexually excited when they looked at a table leg and thought of a woman's leg. And so they were afraid that men had such a quick trigger that they would become sexually excited by thinking of women's legs when they looked at a table's legs. So they changed the name. They changed the word that you use for them. If you were in a proper society during the Victorian era, during the Victorian era in the 18th, the 19th, and early 20th century, you could get in trouble for calling a table leg a table leg. You had to call it a limb, a table limb, as stupid as that sounds. But we came from a very sexually repressed society at that time, and that's one of the things you really need to remember. A lot of a lot of psychology came from that era. And so some of our sexual repression, some of the ideas of sexual repression comes out of that era. Phrygophobia is the morbid fear of catching cold. It's found largely in China. People avoid cold air, eating cold food, dress with several layers. This disorder has been linked to other psychological disorders such as hypochondriasis and obsessive compulsive disorder. Even in the summertime, when it's 80, 90 degrees outside, these people will wear jackets and long sleeve shirts and hats, stocking caps to keep from getting cold. They're morbidly afraid of getting cold, as weird as that sounds. Phrygophobia may be culturally linked to Koro, where that disorder causes male sufferers to feel that their penises are retracting into the body due to an insufficiency of male element, or yang. Male phrygophobia sufferers correlate coldness with an overabundance of female element, or yin. So one has an insufficiency of the male element, the yang, and the other has too much of the female element, or yin. Susto is a frightening condition in which a person thinks their soul has been caused to become dislodged from their body, causing a variety of physical and psychological symptoms. It is primarily found in Latin America. I looked this thing up and it's really hard to find any information on it. But the idea is that it's a dissociative disorder. You feel like your soul has been taken away from you. And of course, if you don't have a soul, then what happens next? Voodoo death, a person is convinced a curse has been placed on him or her, or he or she has broken a taboo, results in severe fear reaction, which may lead to death. It's mostly found in Africa and in the Caribbean. And in the United States, in the New Orleans area. Lata, a transient dissociative state brought on by a startling event, followed by engaging in cultural inappropriate behavior, after which the person has no memory of the episode. Found primarily in Southeast Asia, but also in Siberia and amongst the Ainu in Japan. Of course, the Ainu live in the northern portion of Japan, as weird as that may seem. So what happens is they probably say, they swear during if they get scared, and then they claim that they can't. Well, they don't claim. They forget that they did it. People will tell them, this is what you said, and then they'll say, no, that's not it at all. Malgry is a concern that one has been invaded by a totemic spirit that makes them sick, tired, and drowsy because they entered the sea or a new territory without having engaged in appropriate ceremonial rituals. This is identified among Aboriginal Australians. So when you go into a new territory, each Aboriginal group had their own territory. If you go into somebody else's group, then you have to do certain ceremonial rituals in order to not insult the spirit that lives in that area. Agonias is an anxiety disorder that includes a burning sensation, loss of breath, and sleeping, among other symptoms, primarily found in Portugal and the Azores. Agonias. Kufung-Assisa is anxiety and somatic problems associated with mental exhaustion stemming from too much thinking. This is what happens to students during finals week. Primarily, it's found in Africa, Caribbean, among Native Americans, and East Asia. I have never heard anyone talk about mental exhaustion or thinking too much on either the Fort Belknap Reservation, the Flathead Reservation, Salish Kootenai, and or the Navajo Nation. I've never heard anybody talk about this. So it must be other Native Americans that live someplace else. Attacks of nerves, feeling palpitations, numbness, and a rising heat sensation during emotionally charged situations such as funerals. It has been found in Puerto Rico. The individual will react just like this lady is reacting. Universal syndromes highlight the biological basis of these psychopathologies. Still, prevalence and manifestations of these disorders may differ across cultures. The DSM-5 major depressive disorder diagnosed, this is diagnosed if you have 5 of the following 9 symptoms: depressed mood, inability to feel pleasure, change in weight or appetite, sleep problems, psychomotor change, fatigue or loss of energy, feeling worthless or guilty, poor concentration, suicidality. Major depressive disorder has been found in all cultures that people have studied. Prevalence rates appear to vary. Depression prevalence rates vary in the United States based on diagnostic criteria. The rate in China is about 1/5 that observed in the West. One proposed rationale for this is due to 2 different manifestations of symptoms. Somatization, symptoms are primarily physiological, such as loss of appetite. Psychologization, symptoms are primarily psychological, such as depressed mood. Many Chinese psychiatric patients are diagnosed with neurasthenia. Neurasthenia is poor appetite, headaches, insomnia, and inability to concentrate. Neurasthenia was dropped from the DSM because symptoms were more physiological than psychological. It was dropped after the DSM-3. Some have argued that most Chinese neurasthenia actually qualifies for depression, even if only 9% of them report feeling depressed. Social anxiety disorder is a fear of acting in an inept and unacceptable manner, leading to negative social consequences. Research has shown that East Asians exhibit more social anxiety symptoms than European Americans. Accordingly, evidence suggests that interdependence is associated with heightened social anxiety. However, social anxiety is less documented in East Asian countries. It has been documented universally, but counterintuitively, it is less documented in East Asian countries than in North American countries, despite greater concerns about social harmony and maintaining face in East Asia. Certainly, East Asians exhibit greater social anxiety symptoms, and there is some link between interdependence and social anxiety symptoms. In general, though, the rates of social anxiety disorder in North America and Europe are 14 times higher than rates in East Asia. The paradox between East Asians experiencing more symptoms but not meeting clinical criteria for social anxiety disorder may be due to the differences in what behaviors are considered culturally normative. In Western cultures, the norm is for people to be extroverted. In East Asian cultures, the norm is for people to be introverted. That's not to say that social anxieties do not become a problem in East Asian cultures. There is a culture-bound disorder called Taijin Kuryufusho, or a fear of confronting others. It is fear that is solicited by social situations such that one is concerned about how uncomfortable one makes other people feel, perhaps because of their gaze, body odor, or sweating. It is similar to social anxiety disorder because it is effectively treated using the same antidepressant as is used to treat social anxiety disorder. It has thus far been limited to Japan, China, and South Korea. Suicide rates vary dramatically around the world. Eastern Europe tends to have the highest rates. Muslim nations tend to have the lowest. Suicide rates also vary depending on one's age, with the elderly generally being more likely to commit suicide in most cultures. There is a special case in Micronesia in which there is a spike in adolescent age group. This started primarily in the 1970s when a spate of suicides occurred among adolescent men over seemingly trivial problems with no obvious psychological issues to begin with. These suicides were also restricted to specific islands, particularly the suburban regions of these islands. Some have suggested that this spike was due to westernization of the island, leading to a loss of traditional roles for young men. And here we see the spike in Micronesia. We see the spike in Micronesia. And what was going on in Hungary, where the rate is higher. Where's the United States? The orange line. Okay, the United States. There you go. They've knocked off the curve. Anyway, Micronesia. The green one is Japan. And of course, people commit suicide in Japan. They've got a forest where people go out and kill themselves. So why is suicide so high in Japan? In Japan, it's the problem is getting into college and getting into a good high school. If you don't pass the test, and people in Japan will study the test every night, for hours. They'll study it every waking hour. They go to school on Saturdays. They go to school 6 days a week, and they will study all the time. Any free time they have, they'll study to get into a good high school. If they don't pass the test, then they don't go to high school. And for some people who have lived their lives to pass that test, they just can't handle it. They commit suicide. That's why their suicide rate. This is a Japanese suicide rate, as you can see. It's always been higher than in the United States. This is it right here. Yeah, that's right here, I guess. Yeah, as you can see, adolescents commit suicide at a fairly high rate, but in Micronesia, it's an extremely high rate. Losing connection between one's cultural narrative and modern society, lack of cultural continuity, seems to put people at risk for suicide. Many First Nations bands, First Nation is Canada, of course. In the United States, the indigenous peoples are referred to as Native Americans or American Indians. In Canada, they're referred to as First Nation people. Many First Nations bands do not have a strong sense of cultural continuity due to Western colonization. And of course, we teach classes in colonization. Many youth, I don't teach them. I think, who teaches that colonization class? OJ teaches one, but Christine, Dr. Ami teaches one. For you guys, I think it's Psych 200, if I'm not mistaken. Many youths cannot identify with their traditional culture and are also unable to identify with mainstream Canadian culture, and this can be a problem. Support for this argument has come from findings that bands with stable connections to traditional cultural past have lower suicide rates. Such a connection is indicated by negotiating a land claim with the government, possessing self-government, maintaining control over educational services, controlling their police and fire services, managing health services and cultural facilities. The reality is that in the United States, as Europeans marched their way across the United States from east to west, they made treaties with all the tribes that they came across. A lot of the treaties they broke. Almost all the treaties they broke. But as far as they were concerned, the treaties took care of this select group of individuals right now. In Canada, it didn't work that way. The Canadians, of course, Canada wasn't really a country until into the 20th century. Before that, it was just a piece of land that was owned by the Brits, by the English. And the English, they claimed the whole country, and they didn't even bother to write treaties with any of these tribes, any of the First Nation tribes. So one of the things that happened in Canada, um, as when Canada became a country, they decided that they would negotiate land claims with the First Nation people, and that's primarily what's going on. So whereas all this was taken care of in the 19th century in the United States, in Canada, it's been going on for the last 70, 80 years. And in the United States, of course, the treaties have been resolved, and the reservation lands, and they gave lands to different families. It gets it's really complicated. But just to understand that before the 1930s, 1940s, the Canadian indigenous peoples had no rights whatsoever. They didn't even own the land that they were living on. It was land that was owned by the federal government, by their government, by the British government actually, and they have had to negotiate land claims, and they've been doing that ever since. Possessing self-government, in other words, they had to create their own government. The government in Canada had to look like the Canadian government, so they had to have a parliament or a parliamentary structure. Maintaining control over educational services. Of course, Canada had a longer history of boarding schools, and they used to just snatch kids right off the reservation. Of course, same thing happened in the United States, but it was kind of a different situation. What they tried to do in the United States was build schools close to the different reservations. Up in Canada, they call them reserves. They're not reservations, they're reserves. And this was land that they reserved for the native peoples. And of course, they just go in and they just steal the kids, as ugly as that is, and they would get a bounty for all the kids that they could collect. Uh, and then they would send them to boarding schools in various places. Similarities, but not really the same. It was just a little bit more vicious up there. Controlling their own police and fire services and managing health services and cultural facilities. With most American Indians, of course, part of the treaty had to do with health care. That was always part of all treaties that were being made. Sometimes it had to do with money. A lot of times it had to do with health care in the United States. But up in Canada, of course, they didn't have the same situation. So they just not do anything as far as healthcare was concerned and as far as the First Nation people were concerned. So a little bit different, not nearly as clean as it was in the United States. It's been pretty ugly in the United States, but it was uglier up there. Not a very pleasant situation in Canada for the First Nation people. The more these indicators are present, the lower the suicide rate. One fundamental hypothesis that researchers have found support for is that the lack of connection to one's cultural roots is a stronger predictor of suicide rates. This is compounded by the fact that many do not identify with the mainstream Canadian culture, and the reality is they're not allowed to. They're not allowed to see themselves as Canadians. They have to see themselves as separate, as these First Nation people. Indeed, researchers found that the more that First Nations communities can connect with their cultural history, the lower their suicide rates are. Think of it this way. Canada was English, and the English are fairly arrogant people. And if you came from England, then of course that gave you a step up from everybody else all the other immigrants that you were around. If you were native, of course, that the idea was that you're English, and so anybody else coming into the country were second-class citizens. They were all immigrants, whether they came from Ireland, or whether they came from Germany or whether they came from the Ukraine, really didn't make any difference. They were second-class citizens because they weren't English, of English descent. And so where does that leave the natives? Well, that leaves the natives as a third-tier group. And this has been going on in Canada for an extended length of time. If you have English ancestry, then you are considered at a higher rung than if you're come from immigrant stock. And of course, the natives were at the bottom as far as they were all concerned. It's really kind of unfortunate. The communities that have the most number of connections have suicide rates that are comparable with those of mainstream Canada. These connections include having its own policing or law enforcement organization, cultural facilities that promote a community's cultural history, having one's own political body, and whether or not a community is negotiating a claim to territorial land. Despite the universal prevalence of suicides, prevalence rates still differ dramatically across cultures. Motivations for suicide also vary greatly across cultures. Motivations in the West usually include substance abuse or depression. Motivations in Japan often deal with one accepting responsibility and or preserving honor. The cases of the First Nations in Micronesia suggest that different cultures have different motivations for suicide, and it may carry different meaning in different cultures. For instance, Japan has a long history of suicide playing an unusually significant role with the ritualized suicide method of seppuku. And as this shows the individual running a sword through his guts. Of course, that sword is way too long for anybody to be able to do that. They usually use a much shorter knife. It's not nearly that long. Schizophrenia is one of the most debilitating mental disorders and universally found around the world. There are relevant genetic factors, prenatal experiences, and neuroanatomical features. Diagnosed given two or more of the following. Schizophrenia is one of the most debilitating mental disorders and universally found around the world. There are relevant genetic factors, prenatal experiences, and neuroanatomical features. It's diagnosed. What have I done? I've got the same thing twice. Anyway, two of them of the following: delusions, hallucinations, disorganized speech, negative symptoms, catatonic behavior. Those are the 5 criteria. If you have delusions and hallucinations, that's schizophrenia. If you have disorganized speech and catatonic behavior, that's schizophrenia. If you have delusions and negative symptoms, that's schizophrenia. Schizophrenia is a disorder that is diagnosed with when one exhibits 2 or more of these symptoms: delusions, hallucinations, disorganized speech, catatonic or grossly disorganized behavior, and negative symptoms such as flat affect or loss of speech. My goodness, I'm going to say the same thing over and over again. I hope I don't say it again. There is a good evidence of a genetic component for schizophrenia. One's likelihood of developing schizophrenia increases as the degree of genetic relatedness with someone who has schizophrenia increases. Despite its biological basis and similar incidence rates across cultures, some cultural variation still exists. That is, only 1% of the general population will develop schizophrenia. Having a cousin with a disorder leads to a likelihood of 2%. Having a sibling with schizophrenia increases the likelihood to 9%. And having an identical twin increases the likelihood to 48%. As one would expect with something that has a biological basis, incidence and prevalence rates are quite similar across different cultures. But notice that despite the role of genetics, there is still more than a 50% chance that someone who would not develop schizophrenia if their identical twin with whom they share 100% of their genes has schizophrenia. Subtypes of schizophrenia vary substantially. In the West, the rate of paranoid schizophrenia is as high as 75%. The rate of catatonic schizophrenia is 1 to 3%. In India, the rate of paranoid schizophrenia is much lower. The high is 15%, but the rate of catatonic schizophrenia is even higher than that at 20%. Also, patients in less developed societies have greater rate of recovery than in more industrialized societies. This is the opposite of what one sees with other physical and mental pathologies. The cause of this difference is unknown. Some suggest the patients are more likely to remain members of a community in such societies rather than becoming homeless in industrialized societies. Interestingly, patients in less developed societies have greater rates of recovery from schizophrenia than in more industrialized societies, which is opposite of what one sees with other. Explanations of this counterintuitive pattern include laying less blame on the patient due to his or her having less of a primary sense of control, having more positive associations with what the West considers to be hallucinations, and greater involvement of the community so that the person does not get left alone. Just as presentation and prevalence of psychological disorders vary across cultures, the same goes for how the disorders are treated. There is a tradition in the West of patients seeing a therapist and verbalizing their feelings and problems, likely rooted in Western emphasis on self-expression and being in a low-context culture, among many other ideas discussed in this course. There is cultural variation in coping and seeking support. East Asians are less likely than European Americans to actively seek social support. This is due to concerns about how this will disrupt relationships with others. Instead, they rely on implicit social support, reminding themselves of the close relationships that they have. This may explain why East Asians tend to seek professional mental health treatment less than Westerners. Western treatment traditions can be traced back to Freudian times. Psychological problems are best treated by exploring people's memories and experiences. As treatment has extended into modern times, there is an emphasis on understanding the individual, his/her self-discovery, and his/her cognitive biases. Freud thought that psychological problems were best treated by exploring people's memories and experiences because such problems were believed to be rooted in people's conflicts at an unconscious level, and the therapist should then interpret those experiences and memories. Carl Rogers then introduced the client-centered approach, and other biological modes of thought have since been developed as well. But the common thread running through all the different therapy options is the client's ability to engage with the therapist. In contrast to the Western style, two broad categories of treatments can be seen elsewhere. Family-centered, families seen as a key source of guidance and play an important role in treatment, and spiritualism and religion, construing psychological disorders as a problem with one's spirituality or a relationship with God or gods that went awry. And of course, this is what happened. If you know anything about this, spiritualism was real popular at the end of the 20th century and the beginning of at the end of the 19th century and in the beginning of the 20th century, especially after World War I. There were a lot of men that died during World War I. About 10 million of them died during the war. And there were a lot of people that lost all their family, or just about all their family. So one of the things that happened at this time, and of course this is a picture of what was going on right after World War I. They were trying to contact their dead relatives who had died in the war. In other cultures, healing practices are performed very differently. One of the most common practices is the role of families. They share the problems with the individual and also share the stigma and blame associated with whatever mental illness the individual has. Another common practice involves spiritualism and religion, which incorporates traditional healers such as shamans and sorcerers. Japan also has a couple of unique approaches to psychotherapy that reflect the cultural inclinations of Japan. The two are called Morita Therapy and Nikan Therapy. Morita Therapy is used to treat depression and anxiety symptoms. does so by emphasizing secondary control, asking clients to accept the circumstances of their lives. Clients must change their perspectives of the symptoms and learn to live productively in spite of those symptoms. To live productive lives, the treatment plan involves light manual activities such as sweeping, heavy manual labor such as chopping wood, and other forms of life training. It's interesting, but in Europe, at the turn of the 19th century, at the beginning of the 20th century into the 19th century, they had asylums where people did exactly the same thing. Light manual labor or heavy manual labor, as curious as that is. Of course, these people, this is volcanic ash that they're covering these people with, and it is warm, it's heated, and of course they're trying to relax them, take away their anxieties with this. This is another part of Morita Therapy. Nikon therapy is used to treat people with depression and addiction problems. Clients are asked to reflect on their past, particularly on the kindnesses that they have received from others, while thinking about how little they have offered in return for those kindnesses. Given the cultural diversity and prevalence rates of psychopathologies, one concern that has been raised is whether Western mental health treatments may sometimes do more harm than good. For instance, it's been argued that anorexia did not exist in the same form in Hong Kong until it was imported there. Similarly, post-traumatic stress disorder was not a big problem in Sri Lanka after the 2004 tsunami until Western aid workers insisted that they must be suffering from it. And of course, you can convince people of just about anything. This lady is very, very slender. That's not normal. And that is the end of the slideshow. I want to thank everybody for being so attentive to my lectures. That is the end of Psych 350. Let's see, what are your requirements? Just answer the discussions. Now you can take the last test. And a paper, and that's it. That's all there is to this class. So stay safe, stay home, and I'll see you later. Don't forget about the curfew over the weekend. I'm sure if you do forget about it, somebody will tell you about it. Anyway, good luck.